If you watched the video this channel posted about 2 weeks ago when the game first launched, you might have noticed the comment section got pretty active. A lot of people pushed back on how the connection between the original and the sequel was explained. And they were right too. That video got the timeline wrong, not slightly off, fundamentally wrong in a way that changed the whole picture of what the sequel actually is and when it takes place. So this is the corrected version, and I want to be upfront about exactly what we got wrong, because honestly, the correct answer is more interesting than what we originally said. Both games take place at the very beginning of a zombie outbreak. The original during the 2010 to 2011 period, the sequel in 2028, both set during the early collapse of civilization. The 17-year gap between those two dates is not 17 years of zombie apocalypse having passed. The developers described the sequel as taking place at the same starting point as the original, an outbreak, just more recently. And that is the thing the previous video completely missed. So what do both games actually show, and why does that matter? The original's lore places the virus detection back in 2008 when a CDC study found a dormant virus present in a large portion of the population. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody treated it as urgent. In 2009, the first cases of people falling into coma-like states appeared worldwide, but got completely buried under the swine flu pandemic that was dominating health news at the time. By 2010, a massive wave of those coma cases had swept across the world, and somewhere in the 2010 to 2011 period, the people in those comas started flatlining and getting back up. That is when the original game begins, not at the virus detection in 2008. At the moment, the dead started rising after years of the virus spreading completely undetected. Infrastructure is still partially working. Emergency services are already struggling with the disaster. The government response is organizations like the Federal Emergency Management Agency trying to manage something they were never built for. Both runners and shamblers exist in the original, with the slower, shambler type being more common, given how far the outbreak had already progressed. The sequel's lore follows the exact same pattern, just moved forward in time. In 2025, a scientist named Dr. David Mead identified the virus and requested the budget to research it properly. The request was denied. In 2026, the virus mutated and caused a mass wave of people falling into comas. And in 2028, it mutated again and the dead started rising. The sequel takes place in 2028 at that exact moment. Streets still burning, vehicles still working, infrastructure still partially intact. Because just like the original, the sequel is depicting the outbreak during its early collapse rather than an apocalypse that has been running for years. The developers described the sequel as not a direct sequel. It takes place at the same starting point as the original, an outbreak, but in a more recent setting with different characters and updated lore. There are also older developer discussions suggesting the timeline was deliberately moved forward to give the sequel a contemporary setting rather than being rooted in the early 2000s. Call it a retcon or an updated setting. Either way, the difference in dates reflects the developers choosing a more recent time frame rather than continuing directly from where the original left off. And the treatments work the same way in both games too. Phalanx pills and gene therapy are not new developments that appeared between the two games. They existed in the original as well. Another detail that connects the two rather than separating them, the zombie detail that came up in the comments, is actually the most interesting part of how the two games connect. The original has mostly shamblers, slow, decomposing, moving like the classic horror films the franchise takes its name from. The sequel has runners, fast, aggressive, freshly turned. The zombie life cycle described in the sequel's lore explains this. Freshly turned bodies become runners first. As the body deteriorates, the zombie eventually slows into a shambler. Further decomposition produces crawlers. The zombies in the original feel slower and heavier because they have been dead longer. The runners in the sequel are so aggressive because the outbreak is so recent that most bodies have not had time to decompose yet. The slower zombies in the original are not a different strain. They are the same virus at a different stage of the same process. One infection. Two games showing different stages of the outbreak. And then there are the details that make the connection between the two games genuinely hard to argue with. Iceland. The original lore establishes Iceland as the only place in the world without zombies, and identifies it as a destination for rescued survivors. The sequel keeps that. Extraction still points toward Iceland. Same location, same role in the story. That alone tells you something important about how connected these two games actually are. And then there is Roge. Roge is a character from the original. In an official April 2025 update, the sequel confirmed that his voice is based on the original game's character of the same name. That is not a fan theory, that is in the official patch notes. What that strongly suggests is that Roge survived the events of the original and exists in the world of the sequel. It does not confirm every detail of how he got there, but a character carrying over from one game to the other with official confirmation is one of the clearest signs that these two games share the same world. So, why do the two games feel so different if they share the same fundamental premise? Because the sequel was built to feel like a fresh experience rather than a continuation. The developers describe it as not a direct sequel, different characters, different maps, different lore details. Think of it the way a filmmaker might retell the same core outbreak concept in a different decade. The foundation stays the same. The world around it gets updated. The tone feels different because the game is built with better tools on a better engine. The setting feels different because 2028 looks and feels different from the early 2010s. But underneath it is the same 732-ZH virus. The same desperate early days of civilization falling apart before anyone has figured out how to survive it. To everyone who pushed back in the comments on the original video, you were right. The framing that the sequel takes place 17 years into an ongoing apocalypse was wrong. The developers are clear that the sequel is set at the same starting point as the original, an outbreak. Just more recently, the burning streets, the working vehicles, the active infrastructure that the comments pointed to as evidence, those details make sense now. The sequel is showing the beginning of the collapse just like the original did. The environmental details were the correct clue. The conclusion about different universes was not quite right, but the instinct behind it was good. The sequel is not presented as the next chapter of a continuous 17-year apocalypse. It is the same fundamental premise told in a more recent setting. Thank you to everyone who pushed back. The comments made this video better. So to bring it all together, both games follow a strikingly similar pattern. The virus exists years before the mass reanimation event. A widespread coma phase follows, and eventually, the dead begin rising. According to the timelines presented in each game's lore, that pattern played out from 2008 to the 2010 to 2011 period in the original, and from 2025 to 2028 in the sequel. Iceland appears in both as the only safe place on Earth. Phalanx and gene therapy exist in both. A character from the original appears in the sequel with official confirmation, and both are set at the beginning of an outbreak, rather than years into an ongoing apocalypse. The 17-year gap should not be interpreted as 17 years of storytime passing between the games. The developers described the sequel as returning to the starting point of an outbreak, but in a more recent setting. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Because Iceland surviving when everywhere else did not is the next question that deserves a proper dedicated video. And there is a lot more to unpack there than most people expect. And drop a comment. Both games follow the same pattern. Virus detected years before anyone takes it seriously. Mass coma phase, then the dead start rising. The same pattern. 17 years apart. Does that feel like a coincidence to you? Because the more I think about it, the more I wonder whether that pattern was always going to repeat eventually, regardless of when anyone found the virus. Tell me what you think.